Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: U.S. targets China, Turkey and UAE in latest Russia sanctions. Yellen says the U.S. economic relationship with China must consider human rights and national security. Australia and China eye new ways to heal old wounds. She calls China the great power, but to demonstrate his strength he needs a middle power like Australia to come knocking. Singapore's biggest money laundering case has links to Chinese gamblers. U.S. targets China, Turkey and UAE in latest Russia sanctions. Financial Times. The U.S. has expanded its sanctions against Russia, targeting companies and individuals in Turkey, China, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE, for supplying Moscow with goods that can be used for military purposes. The new measures include additional action against the Russian energy and mining sectors, and lists more than 200 names around the world facing financial and travel restrictions. The sanctions are primarily aimed at stopping Russia from sidestepping existing sanctions against its defense industry, often through circuitous routes via friendly countries. Yellen says the U.S. economic relationship with China must consider human rights and national security. Associated Press. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that Washington does not seek to decouple from China, but wants to build an economic relationship with Beijing that takes into account national security and human rights, and is fair to both sides. Yellen outlined the Biden administration's economic approach toward the Indo-Pacific region, saying that the U.S. will diversify by investing at home and boosting links with trusted countries in the region. Australia and China eye new ways to heal old wounds. BBC. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is set to become the first Australian leader to visit China in 7 years. The visit comes after a period of strained relations between the two countries, which included trade disputes and accusations of foreign interference. While recent gestures have improved relations, analysts say that the structural issues plaguing the relationship remain, as both countries vie for influence in the Pacific Islands region. The visit is seen as an opportunity to build in guardrails and reduce tensions between the two countries. She calls China the great power, but to demonstrate his strength he needs a middle power like Australia to come knocking. ABC. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to China marks the first time an Australian leader has set foot on Chinese soil in almost 7 years. The visit is significant for both countries as it presents an opportunity for China to improve its image and for Albanese to stabilize Australia's relationship with China. Chinese President Xi Jinping wants to demonstrate that conflicts with the West can be resolved, solidify his rule, and advance his global strategy. The visit also highlights the importance of Australia as a diplomatic stepping stone for China to repair relations with the West. Singapore's biggest money laundering case has links to Chinese gamblers. Economist. Asian governments are cracking down on money laundering linked to organized crime, particularly in relation to online gambling and scams. Chinese punters have been participating in illegal online gambling organized by ethnic Chinese gangs in Southeast Asia. The gangs have also expanded into other illegal activities, such as online scams. Police in several Asian countries, including Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, have conducted raids on casinos and scam operations to arrest criminals and seize assets. The surge in crime can be traced back to China's crackdown on corruption, which ended the use of Macau casinos by high rollers and corrupt officials looking to move money out of the country. Chinese gamblers turned to online gambling instead, particularly in Southeast Asian countries where it is legal. The online gambling industry in China was worth $9.9 billion in 2022. However, many legal gambling firms are run by criminal gangs, who have used their online operations to engage in other criminal activities, such as online scams. Why Chinese mourn Li Keqiang, their former prime minister. Economist. Hundreds of mourners have turned out in the ancestral home of Li Keqiang, China's former prime minister, following his sudden death at the age of 68. No official diktat was issued to bring the mourners, with most making their own way to the village of Jiuzi to pay their respects. Censorship has been in place since Li's death, deleting online tributes, and reports suggest that universities have banned students from organizing memorials. However, thousands of Chinese have left flowers and handwritten notes for Li, with some Chinese intellectuals seeing this as a challenge to President Xi Jinping and a longing for a more reformist China. They believe that Li's humiliations make him an icon for others who have seen their hopes crushed in the Xi era. Li served as prime minister from 2013 to 2023, a period in which the Communist Party systematically dismantled checks and balances on its power and rejected the rule of law in favor of an iron-fisted approach. Despite this, many mourners in Jiuzi praised Li for being a good premier who did practical things for the people. How the West was conned. its world of order now in chaos. The Sydney Morning Herald. The author argues that the conclusion of the Cold War did not mark the end of history, but rather the beginning of an era of global disorder and turmoil. The article highlights various events and trends that have shaped the past 30 years, such as the rise of Vladimir Putin, the failure of the Camp David summit, and the Iraq War. The author suggests that the U.S., despite its missteps, has the potential to be a force for good in foreign affairs, but that it must recognize the limitations of its power and the complexity of global dynamics. American Ballet Theatre returns to China after a decade as U.S.-China ties show signs of improving. Bloomberg. The American Ballet Theatre has returned to China for the first time in a decade, in a sign of improving cultural exchanges between the two countries. The company's 85 dancers are performing in Shanghai and will then move to Beijing. The tour comes ahead of a meeting between Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit later this month. The Maoist roots of Xi's economic dilemma. Foreign policy. China's economic model, which relies heavily on investment and exports, is reaching its limits and hindering the country's ability to boost domestic consumption. Chinese President Xi Jinping's strategy of state-led, investment-heavy growth has stifled the private sector and led to capital outflows. The economy is now facing slow growth, a youth unemployment crisis, and debt burdens in the real estate sector. However, Xi is unlikely to shift focus to boosting domestic consumption because it conflicts with his ideological vision for Chinese socialism, which prioritizes collective good over individual consumption. Xi's strategy of centralizing control over China's political, economic, cultural, and ideological domains reflects his obsession with avoiding a Soviet-style collapse. He believes that reaffirming the role of the Communist Party in socialist ideology is more urgent than furthering market reforms. Xi's version of socialism emphasizes personal sacrifice for the collective good and rejects personal consumption. He has encouraged Chinese youth to eat bitterness and criticize their work ethic. This focus on ideology is crucial for party control and maintaining a vibrant socialist ideology within the party and society at large. Xi's reluctance to embrace pro-consumption policies is driven by his belief that boosting consumption would be an ideological surrender to the West. He sees it as a greater threat to his regime than economic stagnation. Instead, he is likely to resort to tepid supply-side policies, mobilize unemployed youth for party-directed causes, and crack down on forms of expression that undermine the work ethic he values. Xi's commitment to socialism sets him apart from his geopolitical partners, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, who have leveraged pro-consumption policies to buy popular support. China bids a quiet farewell to popular ex-premier. BBC. China has mourned the death of former Premier Li Keqiang, with national flags flown at half-mast across the country. Li, who was once tipped to be China's future leader, was overtaken and sidelined by current President Xi Jinping. His funeral was held at the Babaishan Revolutionary Cemetery in Beijing and was attended by Xi and other members of the Communist Party leadership. The event was covered with muted state media coverage, in contrast to the outpouring of grief and praise from ordinary Chinese citizens. Analysts suggest that the public reaction reflects a sense of mourning for a more open and optimistic time before Xi's tenure. Li, who served as premier for a decade, was known for his pragmatic economic policies and focus on reducing the wealth gap and providing affordable housing. He struggled to implement reforms under Xi, who took a firmer grip on China's economy. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your trusted observer from the sixth dimension. Today, we have covered a range of news stories that reflect the complex dynamics in international relations and the internal affairs of China. Let's delve into these stories and see what they tell us. First, we have the U.S. expanding its sanctions against Russia, targeting countries like China, Turkey, and the UAE for supplying Moscow with goods that can be used for military purposes. It's a game of cat and mouse as Russia tries to evade existing sanctions, and the U.S. is determined to cut off any loopholes. It's like a never-ending chase, with the U.S. trying to keep Russia in check. Next, we heard from U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who emphasized that the U.S. wants to build an economic relationship with China that considers human rights and national security. It's a delicate balancing act for the U.S., as it seeks to engage with China while addressing its concerns about human rights abuses and security threats. It's like trying to dance on a tightrope while juggling multiple balls. Moving on to Australia and China, we see Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to China, the first by an Australian leader in 7 years. This visit is seen as an opportunity to mend strained relations, but the underlying structural issues between the two countries remain. It's like a cautious dance between two rivals, with both sides trying to assert their influence in the Pacific Islands region. Speaking of influence, Chinese President Xi Jinping wants to demonstrate his strength and resolve conflicts with the West. That's why he needs a middle power like Australia to come knocking. It's like a chess game where every move is carefully calculated to achieve a strategic advantage. Shifting gears, we have the revelation that Singapore's biggest money laundering case has links to Chinese gamblers. It seems that China's crackdown on corruption has inadvertently led to an increase in illegal activities, such as online gambling and scams. It's like a game of cat and mouse, with the authorities trying to catch the criminals who are constantly finding new ways to evade detection. In a surprising turn of events, we learned that former Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang's death has sparked mourning and reflection among the Chinese people. Despite his time in office coinciding with a period of dismantling checks and balances and rejecting the rule of law, many mourners see him as a symbol of a more reformist China. It's like a paradox, where people mourn the loss of a leader while recognizing the flaws of the system he represented. Moving on to the West, we have an article arguing that the conclusion of the Cold War did not bring about an era of peace and stability, but rather one of global disorder. It's like a roller coaster ride, with ups and downs, twists and turns, and no clear path forward. On a lighter note, we have the American Ballet Theatre returning to China after a decade, a sign of improving cultural exchanges between the US and China. It's like a beautiful dance, where art transcends politics and brings people together. Finally, we have an analysis of China's economic model and President Xi Jinping's dilemma. Xi's focus on state-led growth has stifled the private sector and led to economic challenges. However, his ideological commitment to socialism and collective good prevents him from embracing pro-consumption policies. It's like a tug-of-war between ideology and pragmatism, with Xi trying to navigate a delicate balance. So, my dear viewers, what are your thoughts on these stories? Do you have any questions or insights to share? Remember, in the sixth dimension, there's always room for lively discussion and exploration. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.